I will say, to get us started, we were going to talk about AI and plagiarism detection and where that's going to go now that we have so much AI making the appearance in higher education. On that front, I did see a story just the other day that ChatGPT's rolled back their own AI detector now. And so even they do not get behind this idea of using a detection system to find their own work, because it is not, those metrics aren't necessarily valid. And so there we go.
I think it's worth contextualizing that statement with the idea that even prior to AI and ChatGPT rolling out its own, version of detection, that these kinds of resources are known to give many false positives, because in some disciplines there are very limited ways of expressing ideas. Think nursing. You're going to see a lot of common phrases and words in nursing, which is a very high jargon field, and you can't reword that. You have to express things in a certain way, and yet something like Turnitin has a history of identifying that kind of content as plagiarism, and so that's problematic. And I don't see where AI, lacking the kind of expertise that comes with being a practitioner in a particular field, only being based on these large language models, could make that distinction. I don't know of a nursing professor who would look at a student who has described something the way that they are supposed to describe it from within their discipline, in the appropriate fashion, in the appropriate terminology, would look at that and go, that sounds kind of sketchy. No, they're like, no, that's how we want them to say it, and there's a reason for that. So, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the fallibilities, not just of the plagiarism checkers, but of the AI tools themselves, because they aren't experts, in the sense that people who develop expertise and go to school and get credentials and then work in the field are experts. And those are the people that really can start determining those kinds of problems within material.
I have a quick question, because I don't see this as much in my day-to-day anymore. And even like my experience in teaching undergraduates was in speech, and very rarely did I have a student like plagiarize a whole speech. Like nobody really did that. And to my knowledge, I had very few instances where I was like, did they actually write that? Because part of my thing was, even if they didn't write it, if they delivered it well, like my issue is you need to give credit where that came from. I don't mind that you didn't actually create this speech, because we do teach things like recitation, where you're literally like reciting someone else's, and like oral interpretation of literature. So you're reciting someone else's work. So I think there's a space for that, but you need to like give credit where credit is due. But I'm just wondering, in your areas, I guess we can start with plagiarism in general, but in terms of like AI plagiarism specifically, is that a thing that we're actually seeing? In Louisiana and other places, sometimes we create policies based on instances of very few things that are actually happening. And it's like, the sky is falling, Chicken Little, but the sky hasn't actually fallen. But we've created policies to keep said sky in place that now are obstructing our view. Right now, the sky is no longer clear. Now we've got all these contraptions to keep the sky from falling, when in fact, maybe like 20% of the sky was falling and 80% of the sky was fine. So I'm just wondering, in your worlds, do you see this as an actual like widespread issue? I don't know if you've taught this summer or interacted with students this summer. Is this something that's come up? Do you anticipate it being the issue that would necessitate 15 different versions of AI plagiarism checkers being pushed to you in your email, like buy this, integrate this tool, integrate this? I mean, I just did a Google search, and if you put in AI and plagiarism checker, all it is like 15 best tools to ensure your students don't cheat and the 10 best tools. So is this a problem, or is this just another thing we're being sold is a problem, so we buy more things to prevent a thing that's not actually as big of a thing as it is perhaps being perceived to be? So I have that question.
A little column A, a little column B. So maybe not quite a big problem, but I do think the anticipation of it growing is definitely true, right? We think that people are going to be using AI more, and they will be using AI more. And if you are someone who is concerned that people are going to be turning in work that is not original, and whatever we are intending for that to mean, because let's be real, the idea of what original thought is might change. So we need to be clear that that might be an evolving idea. But if you're concerned about that, I understand why you would want to have something that feels like you'll understand and have a grasp on this in a way that maybe you feel like you don't. And to me, plagiarism checkers and AI detectors are really meant to help you feel secure in it. The idea that we could catch plagiarism or catch AI use every single time is, I think it's a fantasy. And whether that is that we're using the best detection software that there is out there, it's not going to be 100% of the time. I was reading a study, which I wish I had to send the link right now, and hopefully I'll try to find it and put it in resources, that was saying that non-native English speakers are getting caught up by AI detection much more than native English speakers, because the way that they're phrasing is the way the AI detection is looking for phrasing, and what it sees as robotic phrasing or non-native speaking phrasing is something that non-native speakers are going to be using a lot more. And so they're going to get caught up in saying, oh yes, this was written by AI, more than theoretically somebody who is a native English speaker. That's a flaw in the program, right? It's not something that we can account for at this point. And so even if you have the best AI detector that you could possibly have that's on the market right now, even if you pay a ton of money for it, which right now there are, I think all of the products are about the same quality, and there's plenty of them that are free, but who knows moving forward. I think that it is a false sense of security that you're really looking for in that. And I will say, in my work with faculty members, when people bring me concerns that someone has used AI, I mean, really when they bring me concerns that someone has plagiarized, but recently I have been getting people come to me saying, the AI detector found 4 students wrote their papers through AI. What do I do? And what I'm constantly telling them is, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want to handle this situation? One, what is the context here? Is it a context that maybe it would make sense for someone to have used something as assistive writing or in some sort of conjunction with their work? 2, is this a thing that you trust? Do you trust that this is real, that it's accurate, based on all of your other knowledge of the student and your class and all of these other factors? Is this something that you're going to actually trust? And 3, even if it is a case like that, what is it that you want to do about it? Is this a thing where you're saying, okay, this like harshest academic integrity investigation, like let's go, this is going on your record? Or is this a thing where you want to have a conversation with your students about the use of AI? Do they understand what those implications are? Is it a thing that they're going to see as wrong? Or is it a thing that they're going to see as helpful technology that they heard about, that it's going to help them? And so no matter what it is that we're doing, I think that there's always a question of making sure that we're examining how and why we are doing it. And I know that only sort of answers your question, Elizabeth, but I think it's just this, when I say like a little bit of both, it is happening, but I think the fear of it is higher. And it's in that sort of intermingling of people being afraid that this thing is going to happen and that they're not going to have tools to tell, that people get really caught up in this. So that's my quick take, not so quick take.
I'm going to offer my perspective as a former instructional librarian who was responsible for teaching about plagiarism and how to avoid it. one of the things that I used to tell my classroom colleagues when we would have these conversations, especially ahead of my presentations around plagiarism, is that most students who plagiarize are not doing it from some kind of moral bankruptcy, which has always been kind of the way that I felt that some of my classroom compatriots painted their students. And I always tell them I was accused of plagiarism as an undergrad. And of course, they are all like, I'm sorry, what? The librarian was like, it's like, yeah, because I screwed up on a paper and didn't do my attributions correctly. I didn't do my citations correctly. And that is technically plagiarism. And when I started teaching about it, I didn't just stop with copy and pasting as plagiarism. I taught about different ways that people can plagiarize. And I taught that not to teach them all how to do it sneakily, but to explain how people can genuinely plagiarize and not intend to, simply because they don't know how to properly document. They don't know how to properly cite. They don't know how to do proper attribution. And I was thinking about this earlier today in the sense that I don't think that we can treat AI like a tool the way that some people have analogized it to letting students use calculators and slide rules when doing math, because I think AI is something that's so entirely different from those tools that in making those analogies, I don't think we're taking the situation seriously. On the other hand, I think using AI to obtain the kind of material that would allow you to legitimately plagiarize, if one can be said to legitimately plagiarize, I'm deliberately plagiarizing using ChatGPT. In that sense, I don't know that we're any more equipped to do it now than when all students could do was pay a classmate to write their paper. I don't know that we're any more equipped now to determine whether or not a student has purchased a paper from a paper mill online. I don't know that we were ever good at it before, and I don't know why we should think we're going to be any better at it now. You know, really the only way, or the only safe way that I've really heard of determining what kind of writer a student is that regardless of the class you're in, but especially in a class where you're going to require a lot of original writing, is that you make everybody do a diagnostic essay in the beginning. And then you have an idea of what the students write like. And they have to do it in class. Like they have to do it while sitting in front of you so that you know that they wrote it. Not, I'm assigning this for homework and you'll bring it back, because in the interim, hey, they get somebody else to write it. And that sort of sets the tone for what you expect from them. But in writing a diagnostic essay in class, you know, in the early days and you read it, then you get a grasp of what the student does. But I can't imagine every professor wanting to do that in every class every time. Like, especially if you're, let's say you're an English major, you're going to see all of those same professors while you're an English major, probably again and again and again, and they're going to know how your writing evolves. But I think we have to, again, like I said earlier, acknowledge the fallibility of all these tools. And I think we also have to acknowledge this idea that we're not any more equipped. And then in the sense that students kind of have always cheated, not that that makes it okay, but that students have kind of always cheated and we've always kind of been half blind about it, that we can't always catch it regardless, no matter how hard we try, no matter what tools we use at our disposal, no matter how we try, they're going to get through. And we have to, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think we have to make peace with that. I think we have to make peace with our own fallibility in that sense, and the fallibility of the tools that we use. And that we have to remember that education is not about trying to be a gotcha to our students. It's about helping them understand what you said, Meredith, about, do I want to spend the time to put this on a student's record and to go through the process, you know, to take punitive measure, essentially? Or do I want to turn this into a teachable moment? When I was accused of plagiarism as an undergrad, I got lucky. My professor knew me. My professor knew that my mother was going through chemo for cancer treatment at that time, and that my brain was not in the game. And she was very kind. And she goes, I'm just going to use this as a moment to suggest that the way that you write your papers is probably part of the problem here, and that I'm going to let you rewrite it because I know this isn't who you are, so that you can rewrite it appropriately, so that when I get something and I have it in my hands and I'm grading it, it's the actual product that you meant to turn in, that I know you meant to turn in. And I would tell students that I'm teaching plagiarism about that episode in my own undergraduate career. And I would say, but how many of y'all have had this professor in this class before? And most students aren't going to raise their hand because they haven't. And I go, I got lucky. You may not get lucky. You may not have a professor who is understanding and who is going to extend grace to you. But I think we should consider that perspective. I think we should consider that as instructors, as educators, and encourage our colleagues to think that way too. Can we turn this into a teachable moment? This is why in this discipline using AI is not acceptable, versus this is why using AI on this particular assignment is not acceptable, but in this discipline it is. Or in our discipline, in our profession, we're going to be totally chill with AI, and this is why. But across all of these boards, we need to remember that documentation and attribution are important. Giving credit where credit's due is important everywhere, not just in terms of plagiarism, but in terms of adhering to copyright law, in terms of adhering to intellectual property considerations, that it's just the ethical thing to do, and in some cases, the legally obligated thing to do. And I'm not trying to use law or ethics in this sense as, scare tactics, but it's a measure of reminding students about the value of sweat equity, as I heard it once called, that you do the work for something, which means that you deserve credit for it. And just as you do the work for something and you deserve the credit for it, the work of other people that you may be using in your own work likewise deserves that consideration as well.
I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as educators are, what are we doing to show students what we mean when we talk about things like plagiarism? And so my challenge, I guess, would be for faculty who are truly, apprehensive about the use of AI work in the work that they're asking their students to do. My challenge would be, number one, is there an opportunity for you to demonstrate what you don't want to have happen? Because if there is, then you're teaching your expectations. You're showing them. You're not just putting something on paper and hoping that it comes true. Secondly, I would ask, is there an opportunity for you to use AI collaboratively in your classroom so that you're not concerned about those products? So is there an opportunity to have students using assistive technology in creating papers and then sharing those papers with each other and talking about places where you could clearly see a disconnect? I was challenged early in my teaching career by one of my wonderful faculty at Louisiana Tech to think really critically about innovating in the classroom and to not be scared of technology in the classroom, but to think of ways that it could enhance. And he also made the point that to really understand something takes away any fear that it can create. And so I think as we explore these technologies, it's going to be important that we're using them to understand them and not just passing judgment because it's a new thing that potentially could upend our world and cause the sky to fall, as Chicken Little would say.
Well, and I will circle back to what you had originally talked about, some Elizabeth, or asked. I haven't really seen this as a widespread issue. It's been more fear than actual issues. So people are getting excited about this beforehand. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Instead of it actually being a problem now. And I think it goes back to what y'all are all saying, is it's going to be a cultural shift where we talk about how to correctly integrate these things into the classroom to support teaching and learning and take the fear out of it. I mean, I love that, Katie, that, the more you know, the less you fear about it. And so doing things like we're doing right now is going to help take some of that fear out of it and make people more likely to embrace these things, or at least have an open mind. And as an instructional technologist, this is something that we deal with all the time, is people not wanting to embrace new technologies because they think the old way has been sufficient, or the old way will keep working for them, when they are losing out on opportunities to grow with their students, in my opinion.
I love that you are pointing out people thinking that the old way is working and that it would continue to work. And I love that Megan was bringing this into this larger discussion of plagiarism and attribution, because I think part of what's not working that people think is things like plagiarism checkers that already exist. And in their mind, if a plagiarism checker is already working, then an AI detector would already work. And those are the same people who come to me and say, oh, I definitely caught somebody plagiarizing. Their Turnitin score was 85%, without actually looking and seeing, okay, well, they turned in a draft that was now in the system, and 85% of it is the same work that they did. And what you're actually saying is that they changed a bunch of it and they did the work of editing their draft. Or I had a professor once who I was talking to about this, who said, if I've assigned a research paper and I see a Turnitin score under 50%, I know that student has done a bad job, because there should be a lot of content that is coming from somewhere else. It's a research paper. It's not a creative writing assignment. You want them to have taken things. It's a matter of, again, doing an attribution, making sure that your citation is correct. And that's so much of what the actual plagiarism concern is. And I think that sort of bleeds into what this AI concern is that we're not going to have a way to correctly say what's ours and what's the machine's. And how can we note what is ours and what's the machine? And if I'm co-writing with the machine, where does my brain end and machine brain begin? And how do I tell my students, if we're trying to model for them, how do I tell my students what that attribution would be, and therefore don't use it? If I can't figure that out, if I don't have a good method for saying these are the lines, and I don't think any of us necessarily do right now, then I can't tell my students, I can't model it for my students, and all of these other things we've been talking about. I had a professor who was asking about an AI statement in a syllabus, and she was saying she works in the English department, and she was saying, well, should we include something that every single piece of writing is going to be run through an AI detector? You can, if that is what you are going to do. If you are going to run every single piece of writing is not automatically going to go through Turnitin. If you have discussion boards, if you have anything else that is not a Turnitin assignment, that's not going to go through Turnitin. So then that's you putting it into a plagiarism detector. And then you get into things like, which one are you using? Security concerns. How do we know what the algorithm for that is? Whether or not we trust Turnitin, at least that's a product that has some sense of, this is the database that it's going into, and here is the method of taking it out, et cetera, that our university has then contracted with, if that's what you're using, or whatever other thing besides Turnitin that you may be using. Just putting it into a plagiarism check or an AI detector out into the world, who knows? So you can put that, but then also, what do you do when your student says, no, don't put my work through that? And I think that this is a big concern, a security concern, a larger conversation concern, that people just aren't ready to think about the implications, because we are on sort of this new frontier, exploring, not to be like a Star Trek nerd about it, right? But we're like on an exploration. I knew you'd appreciate that, Megan. We're out there, we're on our deep space mission, and we're learning and we're getting information, and we're the ones who are figuring this out right now. And that feels scary, and people want answers, but there are things that we have to think about as we are trying to be good scientists who learn, and what doesn't. We have to keep larger concerns in mind.
There are two things I want to say real quick. The first one is, one of the things that I would say is not working is how we support not just our students' digital literacy, but their information literacy. Because part of information literacy is understanding what plagiarism is. It's how to avoid plagiarism. It's understanding what and why documentation and attribution are important, because that's not really something that's taught from that perspective in our English courses. Like I don't remember getting that as an undergraduate English major. We were taught that you document because it doesn't belong to you, but it's not usually part of a larger conversation about why that's important, why that is academic integrity, why that has to do with the ethics of copyright, intellectual property. So I think that's one place that things aren't working that we really need to give serious consideration to. That's one of my favorite soapboxes, by the way, so take that with a grain of salt. And then number two, the way that we talk about these situations matters. I really enjoyed the conversations with y'all when we've talked about these things, because by and large, there's been a lot of grace, there's been a lot of openness, there's been a lot of authenticity and transparency around these ideas of concern and excitement. And I think that's something else we need to be able to communicate to our colleagues, that when we talk like alarmists about this, the problem seems so much worse. But when we stop and we focus on solutions, or we focus on problem solving, and we think about it in a very rational way, I think it becomes less intimidating. Meredith, when you talked about somebody saying, so we're just going to run everything through an AI checker, do you want to add that extra layer of work? Is that something that, is that something that you want to try to automate using AI? Is the irony lost on you in this situation? And I think that kind of response shows a desire to avoid, not to avoid the problem, but to address the problem. But I don't know that it's rational, because I don't think people are thinking about what extra layer that is. And so I think when we're having these conversations, and I think when we have these conversations with our colleagues, I think it's something that we can communicate to them, that how we communicate about AI and how we communicate to our students about AI matters. And that may be the only way that we're able to model a useful, a meaningful, and an open channel of communication about AI. If we come at them with, if I catch you using AI, if I catch you cheating through, like, if we're going to be punitive, there's going to be a lot of fear. And not only are we scaring ourselves and our colleagues, we're scaring our students too. And that's not, like, I'm a pragmatist, and I look at that and I'm like, that's not very useful here. If you want to be alarmist, that's fine, but I don't think that's useful in the classroom. I think saying, as an instructor, I have concerns around the use of AI. So in my class, there's a very explicit, you are not permitted to use AI. And if it becomes evident that you are using AI to complete my coursework, then we're going to have a very serious conversation. And I think that is something that can be said that is not alarmist, that is not punitive, and that says, I am open to a conversation around these topics, but do understand that I do have a stance on them, and that this is my stance for this course, because in my other course, it might be something completely different. And as long as we're consistent, I think consistent and communicative, I think we can have a lot of productive conversations around these things that can allay not only our own fears around them, but also help our students understand why it matters. Because I know that there's some student out there who's going to be like, what's the big deal? Everybody uses it. And you're like, that's true. But should they? And I think I've cracked this joke around y'all. It's the Jurassic Park joke. You were in such a hurry to see if you could, you never stopped and asked if you should. And what we're doing as practitioners, as good scientists, I love that you said that, Meredith, is asking ourselves whether we should in any given circumstance. And I think that that's a good way to sort of stop, take a deep breath, both literally and metaphorically, and go, okay, what are we talking about here? What is the concern? What is the context? And how do we address it in a meaningful way?
I want to kind of add a corollary to my other question that's slightly off topic, but I think that it applies. And that's around, should there be any type of regulation on the marketing and selling of these plagiarism checking tools, specifically to higher ed? And sort of what part does that play in maybe stifling the ability to have non-alarmist conversations around it? Because, within, it felt like seconds of it felt like we only got a minute or two to think innovatively before we immediately went to regulation. It was like, and then you had to pick a side, like you had to pick a camp. You either are like an innovator, and the sort of assumption is you don't care about ethics, you don't care about authenticity, you don't care about, you're just, all in on the tech and the innovation, or your regulation. And then the sort of assumption is that you don't care anything about innovation. You are overly reliant on surveillance. You aren't really, you're concerned about privacy, but only as much as you can scrape that data to make sure that the students are complying to your policies. Like, there's all these assumptions when you sort of like put people into these camps. And I'm often one to not want to let corporations and industry off the hook. So, I mean, like, how much of this is the fact that immediately Turnitin was like email blasted every institution that uses it and had videos and percentages of their accuracy, and they were like, look, this is coming to a LMS near you very soon to be able to have your students, it's going to be integrated into the thing that you're already having them. And my question is, what part does that play in this, and how does that affect our conversations around innovation and regulation when these tools are literally, we can't run away from them, even if we try. In the same way, we're not able really to run away from AI because they're being embedded in so much of the tech that we use on the data. Our productivity tech now is being embedded with AI. Now these detection devices are also being embedded. And what role does that kind of play in this conversation? And how might that shape not only faculty perceptions of AI and innovation and regulation, but also our students' perceptions of AI and innovation and regulation?
I think they're part of the sky falling problem. I think that their willingness to go ahead and start marketing these tools when we can all clearly talk here about how they are extremely flawed in some very serious ways. I think it might have been legal, and it may be legal for these companies to advertise to us the way that they do. Doesn't mean it was ethical. And I think I keep returning to that distinction with my colleagues in other conversations, that just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's ethical, and just because something is ethical doesn't mean that it's been legalized. And I think that that's part of it, that they are feeding that flame of panic, because they're basically saying, we know that you're scared that your students are cheating using AI. We can take that off of your hands. And the funny thing is that they're probably using AI behind the scenes to get this done. And you're like, I'm sorry, wait, hello pot, hello kettle, I'm black, so are you. And then it's one of those things where they're not acknowledging the limitations of their own software. They're not acknowledging how unethical their behavior is and how it contributes to this larger alarmist sort of response in higher ed. It's problematic. And, I feel like we have to challenge vendors, because they often try to hold us hostage emotionally. And they also try to hold us hostage in the sense that we are all overburdened. And they will present these things as, this is a time saver, this is a task automation, this is going to make your life easier. And I don't think any of us is against, increased efficiency or increased productivity or easing our work burden by automating basic tasks. But I have to ask myself, are we being good educators if we aren't doing our own due diligence to look at the work of our students? And so I would be willing to ask a vendor, how is this making me a better educator? And if the only answer to that question is, well, it's saving you time, then I'm afraid that that is not enough of an answer for me. Just increasing my efficiency doesn't make me a better educator. And what I'm here for are tools that can make me more productive and efficient, but that also enhance what I do as an educator.
So 2 thoughts. The first is kind of a continuation, Megan, of what you just said about your power to ask the questions. I would say that if you are somebody who is very concerned and that you do plan on putting your work through a plagiarism detection software series, that you put an example of what you're going to do with student work. Go walk through that with your students. So if you're teaching a virtual asynchronous course, make a video of yourself, show how you're going to do it. If you're teaching a live face-to-face course, walk your students through it one day. It's a great conversation starter. It also might be a great opportunity to do a temperature check to see if anybody has even been accessing these materials, because to be honest, my guess would be that your general population probably hasn't even been playing with it. My second question would be to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, you teach in an area that when your students graduate, they're going to be expected to know how to use AI and how to utilize AI. So how do you go about teaching your students good, responsible use of AI materials, software?
I think it goes back to a little bit what Megan said, the foundation of information literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, all of those conversations, which I think should be in every communication gen ed class. But I know that we intentionally embed in our like digital communication class. So we have those conversations broadly, just within the context of communication in general. And then as the students start interacting with all different types of software, we drill down into the specifics of data privacy and copyright infringement and ethics, and I can, but should I? And, you know, one of the things that particularly with open AI models, I think that the students who will go on to work at Fortune 500 companies, which I do think we will have some to do that, will more than likely be interacting with proprietary AI. So a lot of the security and data controls and all of that have been like built into it from inception, versus just your student who graduates and they now work for the local restaurant doing marketing, and they want to generate like a social media plan for the local restaurant, and they open ChatGPT and they start they might think, I need to start inputting all of this information that could or could not be sensitive. Like that's two different things. So we in our field have to take that approach, like, okay, this is very different if you go work for like Stripe or Uber or Adobe or Apple or Google or, any of McDonald's, even at the corporate level, like Mattel. If you go work at marketing for Mattel, they absolutely are automating a lot of things using AI, but there's so much restriction and regulation that they've built in because of the value of the IP that they can't let a lot of that stuff get out. So it is in that sense, you focus on the skill of it and being able to use those internal prompt libraries to be able to access those automation tools to be more efficient and productive in your work, because those companies have the capital to be able to invest in technology that doesn't force the students to have to think about it in their day-to-day. Someone else is paid to think about it. They've built it in, you're just paid to work. Versus, which is where a lot of our graduates end up initially, working in small business, where they know these AI tools exist, but they're not proprietary, they are open. And so you have to have the conversation of, no, you can't just in like copy and paste last quarter's like revenue earnings into this system, or you can't just download Google Analytics data on who interfaced with your website and then just throw that in the open system and tell it to generate all of these success metrics, because there are a ton of privacy and data issues in that. So it then becomes a question of, how do you use these systems in a way that doesn't violate any of those restrictions that we know what happened, but still allow you to get the same results. So one of the things that I'm going to have, because I want my students in the capstone class to use AI to do self-review of their capstones. But obviously I don't want them to be inputting their whole capstones into like ChatGPT, Bard, and Bing. So I'm having them make shadow versions that essentially it's like when you de-identify your data to share, I want you to de-identify this information in a way that still will allow you to leverage the AI for structural feedback and suggestion and recommendation in a broad way, but without violating any privacy measures specifically. And that's going to take a lot of work to think about how to de-identify your capstone. Like, this is not just a data set where you just put XXX, like you got to go in, and that also requires them to know what data would need to be de-identified. And honestly, that is such a win if they can walk away with knowing how to de-identify data, not necessarily in the research context, but in the practical context. Because how many people do we know enter their address and credit card stuff just willy-nilly all over the internet, just all of this sensitive information, and you're like, please don't tell me you entered your mother's maiden name in this quiz and then the year that you graduated from high school. Please don't tell me. They don't understand that all of this, whenever that every time you enter your birthday in these reward system, that is one step closer that someone can identify you digitally. And yes, we want the free ice cream and we want the, like, you know, free coupon, and that's wonderful, but also know that that is now stored in the digisphere, and that is attached to, if it's a reward system, probably your name, your address, potentially your credit card or your debit card or your PayPal account or Venmo, and we won't even get into all of that information that is stored. So if I can talk about de-identifying their data in a capstone as the sort of Trojan horse to talk about, perhaps you might want to use these de-identifying practices in your day-to-day, because what is secure? Nothing at this point. We've realized that we are lulled into a sense of security by lifes and locks and VPNs and passwords. But the reality is you are at risk every time you interact in a digital space. So say all that to say, if I can use something as practical as de-identifying their data that then has a usefulness to them, because then they can put this project in and get way more robust feedback than me, the human, could probably possibly give them. But also I want them to evaluate that feedback. Is it just useful? Is there different ways? Like, there's so many levels of learning that can go into that it's not a flat conversation around privacy, plagiarism, authorship, authenticity. It's a very dynamic conversation. And I think it's something that everyone's kind of alluded to, that we silo ethics over here and law over here and regulation over here and innovation over here and privacy over here and security over here. But in our human experience, nothing is that segregated. All of those things overlap and conflate and get gray and are contextual and are ever evolving. And we do a disservice to our students to present these conversations in segments when that's not the world that they're going to have to interact in. They're going to have to make really fast decisions about, do I need to de-identify this data? Like, what, I mean, like, you're not going to have the time to ruminate, not in a world that is becoming increasingly automated, and efficiency and productivity will be the thing that drives a lot of our enterprise. So, I mean, I think having them be in it in the safest way possible in a controlled environment is the best preparation for when they are out there being exposed to who knows what. And I hope that they remember like, oh yeah, I remember I had to take this like 30-page project and like, but at the end of the day, I realized that in doing so, I protected the privacy of the small business owner and their information is now protected, but I was still able to deliver a really solid end product. And then even when they get into places where the technology is a little bit more advanced and the security controls are a little bit more restricted, they're able to free up a little bit more of their brain space to do more because they've already sort of worked through the technological anxiety of having to figure all that out. And so that's, and Katie, you've heard me say this before. I don't think any discipline is safe. I think we think that, oh, there are certain areas and disciplines that AI is not touching. I think that's very short-sighted. And that's like saying technology doesn't touch every discipline. Who's requiring their students all the time to use pens and paper? Like at this point, the expectation is that our students have some sort of device. So whether you are explicitly telling students to use it, there is an expectation that it is being used. Purely from a production standpoint, we're not asking people to write 30-page papers. We expect them to type them. So I don't think we should silo this conversation off into fields where it might be more prevalent, like mine, because it's coming to health sciences. It's obviously in engineering. It's in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. I think about criminal justice and that very complicated conversation around surveillance and just algorithms and things that are used to produce congressional maps and projections and polling and how much of that is automated off of data inputs that affect and impact so much of how we like live and operate as citizens in this state. That's like criminal justice. Like that's not necessarily engineering and computer science. That's political science. Like these tools and technologies, as the students leave particular humanities and social science disciplines and actually get jobs where they have to apply these skills, the technology integration is there. And if we ignore it and say, well, that's not something really in the academic space that we need to be cognizant of, or we need to be intentional about, we do a disservice to our students. And I think we re-entrench that thought that there is no value in what we do because it doesn't really, the degree is not really useful. You know, there's lists coming out, right? Like about which degrees are the most useful. Those horrify me because they're so didactic. They are so reductive in this qualifies you to do this. I say all the time, if you get an arts, humanities, social sciences degree, you can do anything you want, whatever you want. You may have to be a little bit more intentional in carving out that path, but the sky's the limit. And I think a way to address that in a meaningful way is to start having these conversations in these spaces. So I hope, love my English folks, but I hope that you run towards this and not from it. I love my folks in history. I hope you run towards this and not from it. I love the in the arts, all the arts, music, art, theater. I mean, I think there is so much opportunity. And I think that maybe we will see some incredible things be developed from the brilliant minds of our students because we've taken limits off. We don't come at this from regulation first. We come at it from intentional ethical innovation and protecting both student and data and all of the things that we need to protect, but also creating a space to take the limits off that are often the constraining factor as to why our students don't persist, because they can't see themselves in the work. They can't figure out a way to translate the thing that's inside of them to the assignment or the activity that's in that classroom. And maybe, just maybe, I don't think technology is the answer, but it might be a path. So like, why not try it? And why not regulate the heck out of it before we even start? Like, it's a balance. that's hard because this is not new, but it is ever evolving in how it exists in our existence. So it's hard to do what we do, create objectives around, like it's hard to do that. But I think that's why those of us who who will adopt an agile mindset will do well in this space, who are able to make those shifts. And perhaps AI is one of the tools we use to help develop that capability and competency in our students to be agile, to be able to make assessments quickly on, as Megan says, I can do this, but should I do this? Right? And it's not based on compliance. It's based on literacy. And I think having students being motivated by literacy, which is what we want, but a lot of times they're motivated out of compliance, which is what we get. And then we have the issues that we have. That was a long answer.
No, it's a great answer. It was like an inspiring stand up out of your chair and cheer kind of an answer. Don't worry.
Was it my America Ferrera Barbie moment?
It really was. No, Katie, when you see, you'll understand, I promise. Think back to this moment. But what it made me think of, and like a few of you have sort of gotten to this and made me think about, as a discipline, as academics, I feel like everyone is, and rightfully so, concerned so much with academic freedom, with the ability to do things, to try things without repercussions for what that brings. If you are trying to study something, learn something, look at something, you want to be able to do that. Why are we creating this panopticon for our students where all we're doing is surveilling them and limiting them and telling them, we know you're going to do wrong. We've stopped you here before you can even try. And that's the world that we have sort of created. And bringing it back to like the question about these vendors, it made me think about it also, because of course these vendors were immediately so excited to be able to create software that they can sell us that does a thing, right? They see it as a cat and mouse game that just builds money for them. The more that they can tell us, your students are going to do a bad, but we can catch them ahead of time. But then as they develop worse, we can keep catching them. Just pay us more money. Just allow us to keep doing the thing. That's the environment that they're going to create. They're not doing this so that our students can have intellectual freedom, so that our students can have academic freedom, so that our students can understand how to learn better. That's not their goal. They're a company. They're trying to get revenue. We are the ones who need to create that context of understanding, of academic freedom, of integrity. And in all of these things that we're talking about, I feel like everyone keeps coming back to context in different ways, right? You have to understand how this is going to be used. You have to understand what those numbers mean on an AI detector. You have to look at your syllabus statement and see the way that you are putting this together in terms of how you want your students to use these tools. Everything here takes examination, takes reflection, and takes context in a way that I think the analogy to AI here is so interesting. AI is so good at putting so many things together, but we have to give it the context. And it's the same thing in all of these pieces. We are the people who have to give it context for us, for our students, and so that we continue to be able to develop intellectually and use these products to create something better, rather than to create fear that the products are going to overtake us.
But also, can we talk about the fact that like we're asking we don't really ask our students if it's okay to take their work and put it in the software, that read the fine print on that. Like, it's theirs. In the same way, when you use a social media app, technically that content belongs to said social media company. I mean, like, so we are, it's Megan said it so wonderfully, like we are checking for plagiarism by asking our students to give up their authorship to a system that can then plagiarize them if it chooses to. Not saying that that is the intent, but the possibility, because they have all of this content that has been generated by our students. And who's to say that some bad faith actor won't use that in a punitive way? Like, somebody writes this incredible one-act play, the one-act play gets published and goes to Broadway, and who's to say, as someone, as nowadays we see, people are taking old speeches, old dissertations, old papers, and seeing if the president of so-and-so university plagiarized their speech. Like, who's to say that some poor unsuspecting student who was only doing what they were told to do, which was put their work through the detection, is not been accused of AI writing all of their play, like, is not accused of something that is in fact not really what happened, but it was a misuse of the software that they couldn't opt out of. And I think, I don't know, I would love to see the research on that. How many institutions allow students to opt out of submitting to not just AI detection, but submitting to plagiarism checkers? Because I would imagine it is like a course policy, so they don't get. But in real life, I can opt out of submitting click the bottom of the web. I can opt out of giving you anything I want to. I mean, all that regulation not that long ago gives me the right to have control of my data. But we're not really like teaching our student, or not giving our students that agency in the work that they are creating. I mean, it just feels, I don't know, it just feels conflicting in a lot of ways, because we take the choice away from them. And I don't know that there's a solution to that. That's why I'm very fascinated by AI syllabus statements, which is maybe there's that's a segue into the last thing we can maybe head on is, what are thoughts, what are suggestions, what are ideas for faculty and staff who are grappling with the policy and procedure part of this, right? Like, what are we going to do? Is it going to live at the faculty level? Is it going to live at the department level? Is it going to live at the institutional level? Do we see a system level policy? Like, do we essentially see accreditation issues around this? Will that be a thing that's crafted? And where do we see this going from a policy and procedure standpoint?
One of the things that I recently learned in a really excellent AI webinar that I participated in, conducted by a lawyer, was that he said that one of the key things to remember about writing any policy, whether it is an AI and academic integrity policy, whether it is a syllabus level policy, that regardless of what the level of the policy was intended to be, institutional, departmental, individual, that it was important to remember that if you do not, he said that from a legalistic perspective, you should always assume no. That if it is not explicitly said that it's okay, that you should assume that the answer is no. And in one of our conversations recently amongst this group, I said that is not the way students are going to think. That students are going to say, if you don't explicitly say to me that this is not permitted, then I'm going to consider it fair game. And I do not have a background in communication, but my husband does. And we have had many wonderful conversations over the years. I think I'm drawn to you people who have degrees in communication because y'all are just fun. I love how all the people who teach communication on this call are just like, yeah, we know you love us. But he also has ADD. And one of the things that makes that interesting is that he wasn't diagnosed until within the last couple of years. And we used to fight continuously as a couple, and there is relevance to this, work with me here, because I communicate one way and he is not as articulate as I am. He's a very intelligent person. He has a degree in communication. His father was an English teacher. His mother was a reading recovery / literacy teacher. This is somebody who grew up in a household where reading and writing and all those things were valued. He's very intelligent. He's just not great at always being nuanced at communication. And I am painfully nuanced at communication. But when he finally got that diagnosis and we started sort of learning together about everything involved in having ADD and what that looks like in terms of cognitive function, executive dysfunction, and that sort of thing, one of the immediate adjustments that I made as a partner was to never assume that he can assume correctly, and to never assume something that I think seems obvious, because to his brain, whether medicated or not, can simply not process it the way that I would think that he could. I had to start being explicit. Now, sometimes he rolls his eyes at me and he's like, I'm not an idiot. And I'm like, I know you're not an idiot. But by having this diagnosis and by your own admission, sometimes you have auditory processing issues. Sometimes you will hear what I'm saying, but you don't quite get the meaning because halfway through what I've said, you've checked out on. And so all of that to say that I feel like one of the things that is most important about any policy is that it is explicit. Now, I've been looking at other institutions' policies, the institutional level academic integrity policy. That is mainly what I'm looking at this time. And Ohio State's policy on it is that the decision on whether AI can be used in a course or not is really at the instructor's discretion. That for them, at the institutional level, they have created adaptability and flexibility in their policy. They acknowledge that it is a reality. They acknowledge that it can be abused, but they've also acknowledged that it has legitimate applications that should not be bypassed. Now, it's a very simple policy. I'm giving you a lot of nuance, but I already warned you about it. But the policy is beautiful, in my opinion, in its simplicity, because it says, we recognize that AI is a tool that can be used and can be abused. We are leaving it at the discretion of faculty to determine whether AI is appropriate for use in their courses and assignments. They are essentially not dictated. But they've also said in that policy that it is important for students to remember that any use of AI in a class that is counter to the syllabus policy regarding that can and will be treated as academic dishonesty. And I think that's wonderful, because it really, in my opinion, a policy with that much openness creates a lot of space for innovation. It creates a lot of space for teachable moments. It creates a lot of space for, and I mean this in the best way possible, creativity, pedagogy. The students have a space, the faculty have a space. So if somebody's not comfortable now, but they become more comfortable later, they can change their policy and it's still endorsed and protected by the institutional umbrella policy. And I would be deeply uncomfortable, even as comfortable as I am with these topics, obviously, trying to dictate to somebody in a discipline that I don't have intimate knowledge of or expertise in, trying to dictate how they should and shouldn't be using it. And I think our administrators need that reminder as well, that there are reasons that we have deans and directors and department heads and program directors, that we need to listen to them and we need to hear their concerns. We need to hear what they're willing to say and to collaborate with them on the creation of such policies.
So I am someone who really likes to give things like sample language for people who feel very lost. And even if we're not creating policy, even if this isn't going to be our permanent policy and not to be anti-measure twice, cut once, like I'm definitely pro in terms of anything that's going to go into something official, I think it's good to get a jump on this to have something. And for anyone who is curious as to how that would work, I have some sample language that I'm happy to share, and I have it just like on a slide. If y'all want to see, I could go ahead and share my screen. So anyway, this is the syllabus statement. And what I like about this is I think it does cover a lot of the stuff that Megan was saying as a start, just to give people an idea of where to go with it. And then you can adapt this and change it and use it as you want to in order to make something specific to you. But if you're feeling very overwhelmed by the idea that like your university hasn't given you anything, your department hasn't given you anything, and you don't even know where to start, and all of this research that Megan is saying that she's doing, same type of research that I'm doing to create things like this, there's so much of it out there, and it can be really intimidating to go in and start to figure out what is a good policy, what is a bad policy. So a place to start is just to say something like, you can only use AI when it's authorized. If it's not authorized, it's going to be plagiarism. Please see our plagiarism guidelines. Right? That's a good, simple start. And then you can tell your students per assignment, AI is allowed on this, AI is not allowed on this. Because Megan's right, you need to be specific, but if you don't know what that's going to look like yet because you're still developing, go ahead and put something in your syllabus, because your students aren't going to assume don't do it unless you're told you can. They're going to assume it's fine if it's not in there. If there's not something saying I can't, then who cares? So get something that says that they can't unless they can, and work from there. You can also check with your department, check with your teaching and learning center, check with your whoever does your academic integrity, see if they have something that they're developing that does have sample language that they might want you to use. You know, at University of New Orleans, we don't have something that is official policy yet. This is sample syllabus language that I've put forth. And I've had probably a dozen professors email me and ask if we have something official. And I'm like, nope, but here's a place that you can work from. So just as a starting place, this is a good place to start, a good place to think about. You can give some examples. I use ChatGPT and Bard in this because those are ones that people are probably commonly going to be using. But if that's not the ones that you're concerned about in your discipline, you can adapt and change and think about it. You could put something like the use of courseware like Pearson or McGraw-Hill is allowed because those types of AIs are the types of things that we're using in this class, but something like ChatGPT isn't, which would also then allow you to have a conversation about the different types of AI with your class.